Thank you, everybody. My name is Andrew Hunt. I'm from the Department of History at the University of Waterloo. The organizers of this event called me and told me I could talk about anything I wanted. And I thought, well, that gives me so much power. Oh man, I can taste it now. I'm just so thrilled. But I was, when I came in tonight and I saw the big crowd coming in, I was so excited by what I saw. So moved by the fact that so many of you have turned up tonight to this event. This is a fantastic event. I've organized all kinds of animal rights stuff in the past, speakers, and been a supporter of animal rights, and this is just a really great crowd, and I think the organizers have done a magnificent job with this tonight. So I'd like to thank them for inviting me out to this. I've prepared to talk tonight, and what I wanted to talk about here was I wanted to talk about what it means to be a pessimist of the intellect and an optimist of the will. That saying, or that quote, comes from one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century, the great Italian social theorist, author, activist, politician, Antonio Gramsci, who was born in 1891 and lived to 1937. He almost died in a fascist prison, but they released him about a week before he died because he was suffering from terrible health in prison. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Gramsci was many things. He was a radical, a deep thinker, a humanist, a political organizer, like I said, an idealist who fought for a more humane and inclusive society in his homeland of Italy. And in 1926, 4 years after the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini came to power, Gramsci was arrested by the fascists and put in prison. He was actually put in a very deplorable prison called Ustica. It was actually a little island prison, kind of like Alcatraz, just off the coast of Palermo, just off Sicily. And it was there that his health went into a rapid state of decline. As one account noted, quote, his teeth fell out, his digestive system collapsed so that he could not eat solid foods. He had convulsions when he vomited, and he suffered headaches so violent that he beat his head against the walls of his cell, unquote. Gramsci might have lost all hope had it not been for some of his comrades in the resistance who smuggled into him a bunch of notebooks and writing utensils so that he could still write, which is what he loved to do the most. And he wrote a lot of political theory. And one of the most famous series of intellectual volumes of sort of philosophical, intellectual, political economy and thought is actually his so-called prison notebooks. He wrote these prison notebooks over the span of years, several years when he was in prison. They consist of over 30 different notebooks full of his writings. And that's over 3,000 pages. He was a very, he didn't have a lot to do in prison there. So he really did a lot of writing and a lot of thinking. And it's amazing how broad his writings are, how much they cover. And one of the things that he said in one of his writings, he actually penned this on the 19th of December, 1929, quote, I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but I'm an optimist because of will. One might ask, what did Gramsci mean by that? And my interpretation is that Gramsci loved humanity. He loved all people. He loved the things that people made, literature, art, architecture, and great cuisine, and so forth. And he loved being around people. He loved socializing with them. And he had real high hopes for the future of humanity. But when fascism came to power in 1922 in Italy, he saw the land that he loved suffering tremendously under the clopping jackboots of fascism. Tensions in the streets escalated as Mussolini cracked down on dissent. And he saw the land that he loved taking a turn for the worse. Even when he was in prison, after being in prison in 1926, he would hear reports of fascism's rise and then of the spread of Nazism in Germany and the spread of fascism across Europe. And it was very easy in that dark prison cell, so cold at times, so hot at others, and with the terrible conditions, for Gramsci to lose hope in that little prison cell as fascism goose-stepped its way across Europe. And indeed, by the 1930s, all hope seemed lost. With his health failing, as I said, Gramsci was released from prison on the 21st of April, 1937. Less than a week later, on the 27th of April, 1937, he died from these terrible conditions that he was subjected to in prison. He was cremated and his ashes were spread at a little cemetery in Rome. I bring up Gramsci because at the time he died, all hope seemed lost. It seemed like there was no future, really no good future for those who loved humanity as he did. It seemed that fascism had triumphed in Italy, in Germany, and so many other places around the world. And if you just added the facts up, the objective facts, it appeared that there wasn't much hope for the future of humanity at all. Gramsci, though, said something else in that quote. He talked about the importance of being optimists of the will. And I want to talk about those two seemingly polar opposites, because even though they may seem contradictory, they actually go together quite beautifully. Gramsci was also something of a poet and understood the poet's way with words. He was a minimalist. And when I think back on those words that Gramsci said, I now flash forward to our times in 2016 and realize that our task is very similar to that of Gramsci. Our task is to find hope, even though the statistics tell us otherwise. Now, we've all heard the statistics before. We've read them before. We've been bombarded with them. Those who love animals, those who struggle for animal rights, embrace the vegetarian and vegan lifestyle we heard about earlier. We know that there isn't much reason for hope. All you have to do is look at the statistics. 56 billion animals killed worldwide, murdered for food consumption. Billions more sea creatures. That's 3,000 animals dying every second that I'm giving this speech. In the United States alone, more than 100 million animals, including mice, rats, frogs, dogs, cats, rabbits, hamsters, guinea pigs, monkeys, fish, and birds, killed in laboratories for biology lessons, music training, curiosity-driven experimentation, chemical and drug and food and cosmetics testing. More than 50 million animals killed violently every year for use in fashion. Methods used to kill animals including skinning their, beating them, clubbing them, gassing them, electrocution, snapping their necks, and so forth. I could go on, I could spout more statistics, but in a way, one of the reasons I don't like to do that is because it's miles to Pluto. Millions, billions, we lose sight when we start throwing all these numbers out at the real issue. And that is the suffering of sentient beings that we have no right to be doing this to, who tremble in fear in factory farms and laboratories and fur farms and countless other places under the terrible, terrible treatment that they're receiving. So we can see these manifestations of pessimism everywhere. I saw it this morning when I was driving on the expressway, when I passed by one of those animal transport trucks. I looked in those little oval openings, and I swear that each time I look in one of those, there is something deep down inside of me that breaks apart into a million pieces and can't ever be repaired ever again. It's the same as when I watch a video of animals being beaten and tortured in factory farms. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing. You see these fearful beings trembling, shaking in freezing cold weather. The hopelessness in these videos, many of them posted by animal rights groups, that show the cruel and barbaric treatment. We see the despair, the forlorn glimmer in the eyes of the animals, the pigs, the chickens, the goats and cows, the lab monkeys, the orcas and tanks as they await a horrific fate. And when we see those things, I would argue, we also see a failure of the human race, a collective shriveling of our humanity, a destruction of everything that is ethical and good about human beings. Even when you look around at a system where a heroic woman like Anita, who wasn't able to show up tonight, is charged on criminal charges for giving water to a frightened pig in a transport truck. I think there's something profoundly sickening about that, if you ask me. If you're one of those who can no longer tolerate this kind of madness, if you're one of those who does not like the way that animals are treated in our society, you're not alone. The good news is, and there is a little glimmer of hope, and this is where we get to the optimism of the will part of Gramsci's quote, that a movement is gaining traction. Its numbers are growing every day. A movement that understands the truth of the words of author Gary Kowalski. Quote, "Animals like us are living souls. They are not things, they are not objects, neither are they human. Yet they mourn, they love, they dance, they suffer, they know the peaks and chasms of being." Unquote. I love that quote. We can see, those of us who are here tonight, I think we all share a kind of a kindred spirit and a kindred connection. That many of us are deeply moved by these things that we see. We can see beyond the plastic and styrofoam packaging in the supermarkets. We don't swallow the nonsense about humane meat because, frankly, that's bullshit. There is no such thing as humane meat any more than there is a peaceful war. If you believe that, then you've been bamboozled, and I have some land in Florida I would love to sell you, and a bridge in Brooklyn. We understand that cruelty that runs through the massive assembly line of animal slaughter on a global scale, in which thousands and thousands of animals perish every second, has to be changed. And so that even though we feel despair at the sight of these kinds of treatments of animals, despair when we go online and we see one of these animal counters with the number going up. I swear, every time I see one of those, I go a little crazy inside. Even though we feel anguish when we look at the evidence, we know that there has to be a movement that comes together that seeks to liberate these beings under our oppressive treatment. And many of us have come to see the truth of the words of the late great Dr. Carl Sagan. Quote, "Humans who enslave, castrate, experiment on, and fillet other animals have had an understandable penchant for pretending animals do not feel pain. A sharp distinction between humans and animals is essential if we are to bend them to our will, make them work for us, wear them, eat them without any disquieting tinges of guilt or regret. It is unseemly of us, who often behave so unfeelingly toward other animals, to contend that only humans can suffer. The behavior of other animals renders such pretensions specious. They're just too much like us." Unquote. Sagan was right. So prescient. He said that years ago, too, in the 1980s. So prescient. And one of the most discouraging things about this system of mass slaughter of animals is that it has all the power on its side. It has the courts on its side, it has the police on its side, it has the state on its side, it has authorities on its side. It has corporations that are paying right now people to come up with moral and ideological defenses of something that is fundamentally indefensible. So what do we have? Well, it doesn't help that those of us who feel these deep inner stirrings when we see these injustices often feel alone. We often feel isolated. I know I do, speaking mainly for myself here. It's easy to feel helpless, hopeless, cut off, subject to jokes and ridicule because of lifestyle choices, sometimes feeling like you live in a kind of self-imposed exile, alone and without comrades. And so it's easy to come by pessimism of the intellect. But there's the other side. I'm going to speak to it right now, and that's optimism of the will. Gramsci meant several things by this as I interpret it. Not just that we're born into this world whether we like it or not, we don't really have a vote on the matter, we don't really have a choice, but there's more to it than that. If you think about it, pessimism comes to us a lot more easily than optimism. The great philosopher and mathematician and humanist Bertrand Russell from Great Britain, I think would agree with me. Speaking at an event for his 80th birthday in 1952, Bertrand Russell, still full of energy, still full of piss and vinegar, got up and told the audience, quote, "I find many men," and I think that if he were speaking in our times, he would be a little more gender neutral, men and women. "I find many men in our dangerous age who seem to be in love with misery and death and who grow angry when hopes are suggested to them. They think that hope is irrational and that in sitting down to lazy despair, they are merely facing facts. I cannot agree with these men. To preserve hope in our world makes calls upon our intelligence and our energy. In those who despair, it is very frequently the energy that is lacking," unquote. I agree with Bertrand Russell. Pessimism can come easily. But if we just embrace the pessimism, as he pointed out, we miss something really extraordinary. We miss glimmers of hope. We miss fragments of people behaving in ways that human beings ought to be behaving. We miss really beautiful things. I often find that in the faces of children when they see animals, the way they light up, the way they smile, the way they sort of naturally, instinctively love animals, that there's a certain kind of magic. It doesn't take much for us in this room to remember when we were children, when we felt that innocence and that magic and that connection when we saw a little animal. I remember going to the petting zoo and petting the animals and loving the animals and wanting to be around the animals. And recently I watched a viral video of a little boy in Nepal. Maybe some of you have seen it. It was shot just recently, and he had just seen a goat being sacrificed in a religious sacrifice. And he ran up to one of the living goats, and just a little tiny boy threw his arms around the goat and began crying and begged for them not to sacrifice the animal. And he was given some promise, if he would let go, that the animal would not be harmed. I thought that was such a beautiful gesture. At what point do we lose that innocence? At what point is it squeezed out of us by the social norms and mores, by television, by school, by consumerism? At what point do we learn that it's okay to turn a blind eye to animals suffering? Those questions are not easily answered, but that childhood innocence and purity remains a source of tremendous hope for me. I see other signs of hope too. I still have some time. One of those signs of hope is a man named Howard Lyman, a fourth-generation cattle rancher born in Great Falls, Montana in 1938. He was groomed to take over the family's cattle ranch, and for decades he ran a huge farm that specialized in dairy and meat. But over time, Howard Lyman began to undergo a transformation. He was one of those people that the historian and political scientist Howard Zinn referred to as one of the guardians of the system, one of the guards. He ran a ranch that produced meat and milk. But something got to him deep down inside. And who knows why it is that some people are deeply moved by the suffering they see while others aren't. That's one of the great mysteries of history. But Howard Lyman was one of those who was moved, who decided at a certain point, he struggled with health issues and so forth, that he was going to change his life around, and he became a vegetarian, mostly for health reasons at first. In 1996, he went on the Oprah Winfrey Show to expose the horrific conditions in which countless cattle in the United States were raised. And when he went on national television, he also exposed the beginnings of what would become mad cow disease, talking about how cows were fed terrible things, including the remains of animals, including other cows. But even though he started off for health reasons and for environmental reasons, he began to embrace it for what I think is by far the most important reason, for the one that I think makes those other ones pale by comparison, and that is that all life matters, that all life is important, that the sanctity of life takes precedence over everything, the environment, health, everything. He became a vegan for all the right reasons. As Lyman reflected, and I quote, "I spent 45 years in the cattle business, always professing that I loved my animals. But it was years before I was willing to admit that I was more interested in profit than in the animal's health. I finally woke up. Looking into those big old eyes, I realized those animals loved their life in a way just as much as I loved mine, that there was no way in the world I could put them to death again." Unquote. There are other signs of hope. In Africa, ex-poachers who do what they can to help capture poachers who are illegally hunting animals. Part of the large animal rights movement spreading across Africa, spread by such organizations as Activists for Animals Africa and Youth for Africa Wildlife. In China, a country that had no animal welfare laws or regulations 10 years ago, we see an animal rights movement on the rise right now, flourishing thanks to groups like the Chinese Animal Protection Network, leading effective campaigns to end animal cruelty. The Animal Rights Center of Japan is gaining new members every day and organizing a number of effective campaigns for animal rights and for veganism. As a group noted in its mission statement, quote, "We are working to change the human-centric approach to understanding the rights of animals through relating the present conditions of animals in our society and asking people to consider their actions toward animals. We hope to encourage more ethical and sustainable way of life. We have to change the social structure for people. This is only a small concession in the luxury of modern life. However, it makes a big difference to animals who are suffering, who are saved from suffering or death. With courage and faith, we will continue spreading our message in the hope that we can save the lives of millions of animals." The filmmaker Gabriela Kaupawait, who directed the documentary from 2013, Blackfish, was absolutely stunned at the news that SeaWorld recently announced that it would halt its orca breeding program, that it would no longer have orcas in captivity at a certain point, and that it would invest $50 million to advocate for an end for commercial whaling and seal hunting. On the high seas, groups of activists are using ships every day to oppose whaling practices. And activists and filmmakers like Kaupawait have rejoiced. "I think Blackfish struck a nerve," she said. "I originally came into the film from trying to explore the trainer relationship experience. I thought of myself as a storyteller that would pull back the curtain on some things, but I didn't expect the documentary would affect change." That's exactly what it's done. In Spain, the group Igualdad Animal stages regular protests and has mobilized men and women and children from all walks of life to participate in some of the most exciting and memorable protests out there that combine a mix of street theater and performance art. In Israel, in Tel Aviv, 10,000 men, women, and children marching through the streets in support of animal rights. "For too many years," said one marcher, "it seemed that we were a small, marginal group that shouldn't be taken seriously. The turnout tonight shows that this isn't the case. There are many of us who are here because it's time to change people's attitudes toward animals. I have news for you. Animal rights is an important topic," unquote. Movements for animal rights and veganism are on the rise all over, in India and Africa, in Asia and Latin America and North America. Here in Canada, the list of people doing good things to help animals is too long to count here. Animal sanctuaries, protests against the treatment of food animals, court cases on behalf of animals, and most beautiful of all, the animal sanctuaries. Here in Ontario, we have the Guelph Donkey Sanctuary, the Aspen Wildlife Sanctuary, Ralphie's Retreat, Painted Rock Animal Farm Sanctuary, Big Sky Ranch Animal Sanctuary, Cedar Row Farm Sanctuary, Wishing Well Sanctuary, Ruby Ranch, Haven of the Heart, Frog Hollow, Happy Ever Esther. The list goes on. I'm sure I'm leaving some wonderful people out. I'm sorry if I did. I could go on, but you get the picture. I cite all of these examples of hope and human goodness not to say that we're on the verge of bringing a halt to the horrific conditions I was describing a short time ago. Make no mistake, ours is an uphill struggle. But what I am saying is that sparks for change are everywhere. Meaningful, significant things are happening. We are at the beginning of a great movement. These individual acts of goodness do not overturn the monstrous mass slaughter system. But what they do is they show us a different way of interacting with animals, a different way of living with animals. It gives us a glimpse of something that we can strive for. So to be a pessimist of the intellect and an optimist of the will means that we do not deny the horrors occurring around us on a gigantic scale. We fully acknowledge them. We know something has to be done, and we know drastic change is urgent. But on the other side of the coin is the optimism of the will, which isn't just about being born into a world of irrational violence against one's will and then dealing with it. It's about recognizing that a different future is possible, indeed essential, if we ourselves are to move collectively toward the next step of our evolution. We go back full circle to that cramped prison cell that held Antonio Gramsci, much like a gestation crate traps a female sow. And maybe now we can see what he meant by optimism of the will. To see beyond things as they are, to envision a very different world and a different way of doing things than the one we have now, is what it means to be an optimist of the will. Gramsci never lived to see fascism fall. I can imagine how happy he would have been to see his beloved Italy restored to its greatness. Sorry. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In my heart, I know that Dr. King is right. And just as Gramsci didn't live to see the day when fascism toppled, we might not witness a time when all animals are treated with the dignity and the kindness they deserve and allowed to experience to live their lives the way that they wish. But optimism of the will tells us that the great arc bends towards justice, and that the thing we're fighting for, the day when all animals walk upright and free, is a wondrous and magnificent goal worthy of the deepest hopes in our hearts and the unwavering commitment of our minds. Thank you.